Doctor said Clara would never wake up. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and something else, something harder to name. Maybe it was hope, worn thin and desperate, clinging to the walls the way the fluorescent lights clung to the ceiling, buzzing their quiet, indifferent hum. Lisa Harmon sat in a plastic chair that had molded itself to her body over the course of weeks. Her hair was unwashed. Her eyes were swollen, not from crying. She had moved past crying, but from the sheer exhaustion of existing in a space where time had stopped. In the bed beside her, connected to machines that beeped and sighed with mechanical patience, was her daughter, 23 years old. Her name was Clara, and according to every doctor who had walked through that door, slowly, with careful eyes and measured words, Clara was not coming back. But Lisa kept talking to her anyway. It had been a Tuesday in October, which is a kind of detail that stays with a person forever, not because Tuesdays are remarkable, but because they're so profoundly ordinary. Clara had been driving home from her graduate school campus, where she studied environmental biology. She had a coffee cup in the cup holder. She had a playlist going. Her roommate would later tell Lisa it was a Phoebe Bridgers album, which made Lisa cry for reasons she couldn't entirely explain. A truck ran a red light. The collision was severe enough that first responders had to use extraction equipment to remove Clara from the vehicle. Her brain had been deprived of oxygen for a period of time that the doctors described with clinical precision, but that Lisa could only understand in human terms, as a period long enough to change everything. Clara was brought to the neurological intensive care unit of a hospital in Portland, Oregon. By the time Lisa arrived, her daughter had already been assessed, scanned, evaluated, and assigned a prognosis that nobody wanted to say out loud, but that everyone seemed to already believe. Severe traumatic brain injury, persistent vegetative state, minimal chance of meaningful recovery. Lisa sat down in that plastic chair, took her daughter's hand, and said, "I'm here. I'm right here." She didn't know why she said it. She just knew she could not say it. Over the next several days, a rotating cast of neurologists, intensivists, and rehabilitation specialists came through. They were kind. They were thorough. They spoke in language that was technically accurate and emotionally devastating in equal measure. One doctor, a man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and an air of someone who had delivered this speech many times, sat across from Lisa in a small consultation room and laid out the situation. He used words like diffuse axonal injury and cortical function and responsiveness to stimuli. He showed Lisa brain scans on a tablet, pointing to areas that were dark where they should have been bright. He was not cruel. He was honest. He told her that in cases like Clara's, the first 4 to 8 weeks were the most important window. If there was no meaningful improvement in that time, the statistical likelihood of recovery dropped dramatically. He told her about care options, long-term facilities resource management, quality of life discussions. He paused and looked at her carefully before saying, "I want you to be prepared." Lisa thanked him. She shook his hand. She walked back down the hallway to her daughter's room, sat in the plastic chair, and picked up Clara's hand again. And then she started talking. She talked about the drive to the hospital. She talked about the weather outside, gray and persistent, the kind of Pacific Northwest autumn that Clara had always loved. She talked about their dog, a wiry terrier mix named Biscuit, who was staying with Lisa's sister and reportedly refusing to eat. She talked because silence felt like surrender. What Lisa did not know, what nobody told her in those early days, was that there's a growing body of research suggesting that patients in vegetative or minimally conscious states may retain far more awareness than their outward presentation suggests. This is not fringe science. This is work being done at major research institutions. And it has been quietly reshaping how some neurologists think about consciousness, awareness, and the importance of sensory stimulation during the recovery window. Dr. Adrian Owen, a neuroscientist at the University of Western Ontario, conducted landmark research using functional MRI to communicate with patients who appeared to be in vegetative states. When asked to imagine playing tennis or navigating through a familiar house, some patients showed distinct and measurable brain activity, patterns that corresponded to conscious thought. The implications were extraordinary and disturbing in equal measure. Some of these people were conscious, aware of their surroundings, potentially hearing every word spoken in their presence, and had no way to communicate that awareness. Other researchers have examined the role of familiar voices in stimulating neural activity. Studies have suggested that hearing the voice of a loved one, particularly a parent or partner, activates different regions of the brain than hearing a stranger's voice or ambient noise. The brain, even when catastrophically injured, may retain pathways for emotional recognition that persist beyond other cognitive functions. None of this guarantees recovery. None of this is a cure. But it raises a question that Lisa was already answering instinctively without knowing the science. Does it matter that you're still talking to her? Maybe. Maybe it matters more than anyone knows. By the end of the first week, Lisa had established what she would later describe as a routine. She arrived at the hospital each morning before 8 o'clock. She brought a thermos of coffee, the same dark roast she and Clara used to make together on Saturday mornings, a ritual so specific that the smell alone felt like a kind of prayer. She would sit in the chair, take Clara's hand, and begin. She started each session with the same words. "Good morning, Clara. It's Mom. I'm here." Then she would talk. She'd talk about the news. Not the heavy news, not the kind that weighs on you, but the small and human news. The neighbor's cat had gotten stuck in a tree. There was a documentary on television about migratory birds that Clara would have loved. The coffee shop near Lisa's apartment had changed its menu, which was an outrage. She read aloud from books. Clara had been a reader, voracious, omnivorous, the kind of person who carried 2 books in her bag in case she finished one. Lisa worked through a stack of Clara's favorites, chosen from a shelf in Clara's apartment with the help of her roommate. She read slowly, pausing sometimes to comment, to editorialize, to argue with the author the way Clara herself would have done. She played music. She brought a small Bluetooth speaker and filled the room, quietly mindful of other patients, with the music Clara loved. Phoebe Bridgers, yes, but also Sufjan Stevens and some older things, Joni Mitchell and Nick Drake, music that had texture and longing built into its structure. She told stories. She told Clara about the summer they drove up the Oregon coast when Clara was 9 years old, stopping at every lighthouse they could find. She told her about the winter she taught Clara to make pierogi from a recipe passed down from Lisa's grandmother, how the first batch had been catastrophe, and how they had laughed until their eyes watered. She told her about the morning Clara called to say she'd been accepted to graduate school, how Lisa had stood in her kitchen holding the phone to her chest after they hung up, too full of feeling to do anything else. She built a world out of words, and she placed her daughter at the center of it. There were moments, many moments, when Lisa wondered if she was doing something foolish. She was not a woman given to magical thinking. She had a practical mind, the kind that balances checkbooks and reads instruction manuals. She had no religious framework that promised her miracles. She was working entirely on instinct, on love, on the stubborn refusal to accept that her daughter was already gone when her daughter was right there, breathing, warm to the touch, present in the room. Other family members were less certain. Lisa's sister came to visit twice and wept in the hallway, unable to compose herself enough to come inside. Clara's father, Lisa's ex-husband, a man she hadn't spoken to in years, flew in from Denver and sat in a room for an hour in stricken silence. He and Lisa didn't argue, but they didn't agree either. He flew back to Denver after 3 days. He sent money for the expenses. Friends came and went. Some were better at it than others. One of Clara's graduate school professors showed up unannounced one afternoon, stood in the doorway for a long moment, and then came in and sat beside Lisa and held her hand without saying anything. Lisa appreciated that more than she could express. A social worker was assigned to the family. She was a calm, capable woman named Renata, who specialized in families navigating long-term neurological care. She met with Lisa weekly. She validated her feelings. She provided resources. She also, gently and repeatedly, prepared Lisa for possibility that Clara's condition might not change. "What you're doing matters," Renata told her once. "Regardless of the outcome, what you're doing matters." Lisa held on to that. In the 6th week, something happened. It was a Thursday afternoon. Lisa was in the middle of reading aloud from a novel Clara had been working through before the accident. She'd found the bookmark still tucked inside, right at the beginning of chapter 11, and she had started there, reading forward from where Clara had left off, as if she might need to know how the story continued. She paused to take a sip of coffee. She looked at Clara's face. Clara's eyelid moved. It was not the involuntary flickering that Lisa had been warned about. The reflexive eye movements that were neurological noise, not signal. This was different. This was directional. Clara's eye had moved beneath the lid in a way that felt, even to Lisa's untrained perception, like something deliberate. Lisa set down her cup. She leaned forward. "Clara?" Nothing. The machines continued their mechanical conversation. Lisa sat back. She was careful not to catastrophize in either direction, not to inflate it into a miracle, not to dismiss it into nothing. She pressed the call button and asked the nurse to note what she had observed. The nurse was kind. She made the notation. That evening, one of the attending neurologists reviewed Clara's chart and ordered additional assessments. What those assessments found was subtle, the kind of subtle that most people would not recognize as hopeful. But the neurologist, a woman named Dr. Park, who had been quietly more optimistic than her colleagues, read those results with a particular expression on her face. She came to find Lisa in the waiting area. "I want to tell you," she said carefully, "that we're seeing some things we want to watch closely." What followed was not a Hollywood awakening. Clara did not open her eyes, look at her mother, and say, "Mom, I could hear you the whole time." Recovery from severe traumatic brain injury is not like that. It is slow and nonlinear and brutal in its increments. It is a process measured in millimeters, in almost imperceptible shifts that only the most attentive eyes can detect. But the shifts were real. Over the following weeks, Clara's responsiveness to stimuli began to change. The assessments that the medical team used, standardized scales that measure things like eye-opening motor response and verbal response, began to show movement, not dramatic movement, but consistent directional movement. She began to track movement with her eyes. She began to show what appeared to be responses to pain, not just reflexive, but purposeful. She began, eventually, to respond to her name. The medical team was cautious. Clara was reclassified from a vegetative state to a minimally conscious state, a distinction that sounds small, but is, in neurological terms, enormous. Patients in a minimally conscious state show clear, if inconsistent, evidence of awareness of self and environment. They are, in the truest sense, present. Dr. Park called a family meeting. She sat across from Lisa and spoke with a measured hopefulness that was different from the measured gravity of earlier conversations. "We can't make any promises," she said, "but we are moving in a direction we didn't expect. And I want you to know what you've been doing in that room has not been nothing." Clara spent 7 months in hospital and rehabilitation settings. The recovery was hard, genuinely, profoundly hard, the kind of hard that exhausted everyone and required every resource Lisa had, financial and emotional and physical. There were setbacks. There were days that felt like the bottom of a well. But Clara came home. She walks with a cane. Her speech is slower than it was. There are cognitive dimensions of her injury that she will live with for the rest of her life. difficulties with memory, with processing speed, with certain executive functions. Her doctors are honest with her and with Lisa about what recovery looks like and doesn't look like. It is not a return to before, but she is there. She is in the world. She is in her mother's kitchen on Saturday mornings, drinking the same dark roast, talking about migratory birds and documentary films and books she is determined to finish. Lisa was asked, months after Clara came home, what she would say to other parents in the same situation. What would she say to the person sitting in a plastic chair beside a hospital bed, being told that the statistical likelihood of recovery was remote, being prepared for the worst? She thought about it for a long time. I would say, talk to them, she said. I know it feels strange. I know there will be people who think you're fooling yourself. I know the doctors can't promise you it matters. But talk to them anyway. Tell them the ordinary things. Tell them the stories they already know. Read them the books they love. Play them the music. She paused. I don't know if Clara heard me. I will never know. Probably, but I know that it kept me connected to her in a way that nothing else could have. And I know that when she started coming back, she was coming back to a mother who had never, not once, stopped treating her like someone who was still there. That's who she came back to. Someone who was still there. Lisa's instinct, that talking to Clara mattered, that maintaining the relationship mattered, that treating her daughter as a present and aware person mattered, finds more and more support in the scientific literature with each passing year. Research published in the journal Brain and other peer-reviewed outlets has documented cases where patients with disorders of consciousness showed meaningful brain responses to familiar voices, to personal narratives, to emotionally resonant content, even when their behavior responses were absent or minimal. A 2023 study from researchers in Europe examined a protocol in which family members of patients with disorders of consciousness were trained to engage in structured communication, talking about shared memories, asking questions with pauses for response, playing personally meaningful music. The patients who underwent this protocol showed significantly higher rates of transition from vegetative to minimally conscious state compared to a control group. The researchers were careful not to overstate their conclusions. The study was not large. Consciousness is not fully understood. The mechanisms by which familiar voices might stimulate neurorecovery are not fully mapped. But the direction of the evidence is clear. Isolation is not neutral. Silence is not neutral. The presence of a loving, familiar voice in a hospital room is not medically irrelevant. Hospitals are beginning to respond. Some neurological ICUs now provide families with formal guidance on how to communicate with patients who have disorders of consciousness, what to say, how to say it, why it may matter. Some facilities have developed programs that support family members in sustaining this kind of engagement through what can be an extraordinarily long and difficult process. The conversation in the medical community is changing. Slowly, in increments, the way Clara changed. There's a version of the story that is about a miracle, about mother's love defying medical odds, about the power of faith, about the inexplicable mystery of human consciousness. That is not quite the story. The real story is quieter and more complicated, and in the end, more honest. It is a story about what it means to refuse to let someone disappear. About the small, daily, undramatic act of staying. Staying in the room, staying in a relationship, staying present when presence is the hardest thing to maintain. It is a story about a woman who did not have certainty, did not have guarantees, did not have anything except her daughter's hand and her own voice and the stubborn human refusal to accept that love should have an endpoint. Lisa did not save Clara because she talked to her. Medicine saved Clara, or began to. The nurses and doctors and therapists and the staggering complexity of human biology, finding pathways through damage that seemed insurmountable. But Lisa kept Clara tethered. She gave her something to come back to. And there's something in that Something that cannot be fully quantified or proven or replicated in a controlled study. That deserves to be named. Clara still has her copy of the novel Lisa was reading when her eyelid moved. It sits on her bookshelf with 2 bookmarks in it now. The original one, at the beginning of chapter 11, and a new one, placed at the page where Lisa stopped reading the day they moved Clara out of intensive care. She hasn't read from where Lisa left off. She said she wants to get back to chapter 11 and read forward from there herself. I want to finish it from where I was, she told her mother. Lisa laughed when she heard that. It was a kind of laugh that had some crying mixed into it. The kind that is both at once, because that is how big feelings work when they have nowhere else to go. She told Clara, "That's exactly what you should do." And then she made them both a cup of coffee, dark roast, the same as always, and they sat together in the kitchen where they had stood 1,000 times before, and they talked about ordinary things, the dog, the weather, a film one of them had seen, while outside the window the November morning did what November mornings in Oregon do. Gray and quiet and persistent, the kind of day that has no drama in it at all. Just 2 people in a kitchen, still here, both of them. If this story stayed with you, make sure you're here for the next one. Subscribe and be part of these stories.